But let's take you to Ireland now, where the Prime Minister, Simon Harris, is going to provide a state apology for the Stardust nightclub fire that left 48 people dead in 1981. Our Ireland correspondent, Stephen Murphy, joins us now from Dublin. Afternoon to you, Stephen. What are we expecting to hear from Simon Harris?
Well, it's a hugely significant, a hugely momentous day for the survivors and the relatives of those who died in what was Ireland's worst ever fire tragedy and one of its worst ever disasters, full stop, which happened back in the early hours of Valentine's Day in 1981 when 48 young people were killed attending a disco at the Stardust nightclub in the North Dublin suburb of Artane, and more than 200 were injured when a fire that has never been fully explained ripped through the building. They have felt a deep sense of hurt and injustice for decades, especially as an early tribunal of investigation found that the probable cause of the fire was arson, which they saw as victim blaming, and which utterly infuriated them and helped to thwart their calls for a fresh inquest. That was only eventually got underway in last year, which culminated in last Thursday's verdict that we saw here in Dublin, when all 48 deaths were pronounced as unlawful killings, which was an enormous victory for those families. We've been watching as scores of family members have been arriving here at the Irish Parliament for that Simon Harris apology. We're just keeping an eye on the live feed. It should be happening pretty soon in the chamber inside. But we spoke to many of them, including Antoinette Keegan. She became one of the lead campaigners. She was badly injured in that fire, but survived, but unfortunately lost her two sisters that night. And this is what she told us on her way in to hear this state apology.
OK, well, let's take you live into the door now. As you can see, Simon Harris on his feet with the apology to the victims of the Stardust tragedy. Let's listen in.
This day would never come. Over far too many years. I know that you were forced to endure a living nightmare, which began when your loved ones were so cruelly snatched from you in a devastating fire. Their unfinished stories became your story, the defining story of your lives and the lives of your parents and other family members who left this life before ever seeing justice. I am deeply sorry that you were made to fight for so long that they went to their graves never knowing the truth. Today we say formally and without any equivocation, we are sorry. We failed you when you needed us the most. From the very beginning, we should have stood with you, but instead we forced you to stand against us. 48 young people lost their lives in the Stardust disaster. Many more were injured, and even more still had their lives broken and shattered forever. When I met with you in government buildings last Saturday, you reminded me of another time when 4 of your family members waited for days in the cold security hut, protesting your exclusion and hoping for access. I truly hope that the days since last Thursday have marked a turning point, and here today in Dáil Éireann, we finally begin to put things right. To bring you in from the cold and end the neglect of 43 years waiting and fighting for the only thing you ever wanted, the truth. Nothing else, no other agenda, just the truth. I hope this is a moment when the state, which rubbed salt in your terrible wounds, starts to help you heal. You asked me to try to really understand your experience, to really feel your pain, and to immerse myself in your world as you set out in your eloquent pen portraits to the inquest. There I found not only terrible anguish and unimaginable heartbreak, but also love, joy, laughter, personalities, promise, potential, slagging, messing, pride, dignity, talent, innocence, and the deep abyss of loss and loneliness. On February the 13th, 1981, 48 daughters and sons, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, cousins and in-laws, uncles and aunts, neighbours, friends and co-workers went out to the Stardust on the night of the dancing competition and never came home. For their families, in the nightmare that was to follow, their loved ones not only lost their lives, they lost their identities. They were much, much more than numbers. They were bright, beautiful people. They had plans. They had dreams. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Today, as their families did in their pen portraits to the Stardust inquest, we remember each of them. Michael Barrett, who was working that night as an assistant DJ. He was wise beyond his years. He had an infectious laugh. He was 17 years old. Richard Bennett, who loved the horses and took on the role of breadwinner for his family, described as an angel in disguise. He was 17. Carol Bissett, a singer in the choir, a girl guide, quiet in her ways, much loved by all. She was 18. Jimmy Buckley, the life of every party, who loved hurling and had won a competition for his Elvis impression. Father figure, brother, hero. He was 20.
Well, that is Simon Harris, the Irish Prime Minister, beginning to read the list of 48 names of those that died in that Stardust tragedy in 1981, as he gives a formal state apology to the families of the victims. Let's bring in our Ireland correspondent Stephen Murphy for more on this. And Stephen, look, we heard from Simon Harris there how deeply sorry he says that the Irish state is and how they should have stood by the families. What's your sense of what you've heard from the Taoiseach there? And give us an idea, as he was seeming to suggest that for many, many years, the Irish state was against the families and them getting the answers that they wanted.
That's absolutely the sense you get from speaking, as we have done for many years, to the survivors and the relatives of this terrible tragedy from 1981. They feel that the state has been set against them from basically day one, and they identify with, say, the survivors of the Hillsborough tragedy in the UK insofar as that they feel, had this taken place in a more affluent part of Dublin or a more affluent part of Ireland, they wouldn't have had to wait for 43 years for some sort of justice. They feel there is an inherent socio-economic bias against them and their quest for justice, and we may see the beginning of that journey now today, as Simon Harris referenced there as he begins this apology. He's just reading through the 48 names, giving a few details about each one of those, because he wants to try and humanise that list of names, and that was something we saw during the inquest as well. You might notice he's wearing a lapel badge that says Justice for the 48. So I think we heard him just use the phrase, it's quite a vivid phrase, the state rubbed salt into your terrible wounds. And again, that is something that is absolutely reflected in the opinions of those that we have spoken to. The survivors of that night feel that what was already a terrible tragedy, the worst disaster in the history of the Irish state, was exacerbated time and time again when their calls for justice, their calls for a fresh inquest were ignored for decade after decade. The original finding of the tribunal was arson, something that the relatives found as victim blaming. That wasn't actually quashed in the official record until a review of the evidence in 2009. It took that long, and they had to wait until 2023 for the fresh inquest to start, and that culminated, as I said, last Thursday with the verdict they had so wanted, which was that their loved ones were unlawfully killed. So we're going to continue to hear Simon Harris pay tribute to those victims in the Dáil here. We believe that this speech, this state apology, will go on for about 40 minutes.
Okay, Stephen, for now in Dublin, thank you for that. More from you, of course, throughout the afternoon.